Aldona Volinskaya is 84 years old and has been blind for 20 years. She lives on a very modest pension in a tiny flat in Moscow, and she is all alone. After her time in a German labor camp, she was unable to have children. Now she has no relatives left at all. She has twice received money from Germany and spent it on a trip to a sanitarium.
The foundation in Berlin paid for me to stay at a sanitarium here in Russia. It wasn't for long, but the treatment was good, and I really liked it. The Russian government doesn't help much with treatment. Only those who were active in the war get that. And I'm not counted as having been active.
Aldona Volinskaya, like 13 million others from across Europe, was taken to Germany during the war, where she spent 3 years doing forced labor. The young woman was initially forced to work on a farm and later in the vast kitchens of an Air Force base in Cologne. Forced laborers were what kept the German economy running while the country was at war. But they were poorly fed and ruthlessly exploited. Decades later, Günther Saathoff was tasked with handing out compensation. It was a hard job, but it was finished in just 6 years. The hardest part for him was getting the money together in the first place.
A couple of years before the foundation was set up in 2000, German companies had displayed very little willingness to part with money. But in 2000, 6,500 companies got together to start the initiative and contributed 5.1 billion Deutschmarks. Obviously, some were resistant, but others saw it as their duty.
All the big German companies, most of which are still in operation today, used forced workers. But not everyone wants to pay. One example is the Flick Group, which categorically rejects compensation on the grounds that forced labor is simply a consequence of war. But after many years and under pressure from U.S. class action litigation, the majority of German companies agreed to contribute to the 5 billion Deutschmark fund. The German government matched the amount collected. Victims' associations and representatives were always present at the negotiations. 10 years ago, the agreement was signed, and the foundation, Remembrance, Responsibility, and Future, was given the task of distributing the money. It was often a laborious procedure, especially for the victims who had to run the gauntlet with bureaucracy. Many of them were unsuccessful because after so many years, they no longer had the necessary documentation. In total, almost 1.7 million people received money from Germany. The average amount was 2,500 euros, but some claimants got as much as 7,500. At the end of September, the Jewish Museum in Berlin is opening the biggest ever exhibition on forced labor. The representative of a large Jewish organization says the funds were generally fairly distributed.
Of course, it's not about the money. It's 7,500 euros for having been in Auschwitz or Dachau. So the money doesn't in any way compensate, but it's the recognition, the acknowledgement, what that means to a person after all those years.
For Kuzmin Tinkov, a former Russian forced laborer, receiving this recognition was very important. A couple of years ago, the 87-year-old visited Berlin as part of an eyewitness program run by the foundation. He was able to tell young people about his fate. But now he desperately needs more help, and the foundation has nothing left to give.
Generally, I use the money from Germany for food. In the end, I worked as a driver, but I earned very, very little. Then the compensation came from Germany. And the money was spent.
The foundation is increasingly concerned about the last survivors, and the victims' associations are applying extra pressure.
We only have a few years left. If you're not going to do it now, if we're not going to let survivors live their final years in dignity, then we won't have the opportunity to do it. This is the absolute final chapter.
Aldona Volinskaya in Moscow urgently needs to be looked after. And there is some hope that German businesses might be willing to provide more money soon.
Some more money would be such a big help, but I dare not dream about it. More support might pay for another stay in a sanitarium like the last time. I have such fond memories of that.
So far, no final decision has been made, but German politicians and business representatives have begun talks about new funding for those forced laborers who are still alive.